He smells like my dad.
A 7-year-old girl whispers words that no one wants to hear in the sterile corridors of a hospital, where a billionaire lies dying from a condition that baffles every doctor in the building. The child has smelled this scent before, bitter almonds hanging in the air like a ghost, in the room where her father took his last gasping breath just months ago while physicians stood helpless and confused. Now she watches through glass as the same mysterious illness consumes another victim. And she alone knows that what everyone calls natural causes is actually something far more deliberate, far more sinister, and hiding in plain sight among those sworn to heal. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of the child who saw what no doctor could. The scent that no machine could detect. And the moment when innocence uncovered the darkest truth. The fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital in Brooklyn hummed with their usual mechanical indifference, casting pale shadows across the polished linoleum floors that reflected nothing but cold efficiency. In room 412, 78-year-old Edward Klein lay motionless on the hospital bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths that seemed to grow weaker with each passing moment. The billionaire's face, once commanding in boardrooms and news conferences, had transformed into a gray mask of confusion and fear. His fingers clutched at the thin hospital blanket, as if searching for something solid to anchor him to consciousness, to life itself. The monitors surrounding his bed erupted in a symphony of urgent beeping. Numbers on the screen plummeted with terrifying speed. Oxygen saturation dropped from 92 to 87, then lower still. His respiratory rate climbed frantically as his body fought against an invisible enemy that seemed determined to steal every breath. Within seconds, the room flooded with doctors and nurses, their white coats billowing behind them like sails catching wind. They moved with practiced urgency, calling out vitals and orders in voices that tried to mask rising panic. Yet beneath their professional veneer, confusion rippled through their ranks like a spreading crack in glass. Dr. Jonathan Hale stood at the foot of the bed, his weathered face etched with lines of exhaustion and bewilderment. His eyes scanned the monitors, repeatedly, searching for patterns that refused to appear. The machines continued their sterile rhythm, beeping and whirring in mechanical precision, but they offered no answers. Only questions. The veteran physician had seen countless cases of respiratory failure. But this was different. There was no infection ravaging the lungs. No heart condition explaining the collapse, no obvious trauma or disease. Edward Klein was simply fading, as if some invisible hand was slowly turning down the light of his life. In the corner of the waiting area, just beyond the ICU suite, a small figure sat perfectly still. 7-year-old Elisa Lopez perched on a plastic chair far too large for her frame, her legs dangling several inches above the floor. Her mother Marta worked the night shift as a janitor, pushing her cleaning cart through these same sterile hallways. And Elisa had learned to be invisible in hospitals. She had learned to sit quietly, to read her worn library books, to become part of the furniture that adults never truly noticed. But tonight, something pulled her attention away from the pages. A scent drifted through the air, faint but unmistakable. Sweet yet bitter. Organic yet chemical. It carried the ghost of almonds, delicate and wrong. Elisa's small body went rigid. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her book, until her knuckles turned white. That smell. She knew that smell. It had haunted her dreams for months, ever since she sat in a different hospital room, watching her father struggle for breath in those final terrible hours. The same scent had lingered there too, so subtle that the adults had dismissed her when she mentioned it. They had patted her head and told her that hospitals simply smelled like hospitals. That grief was playing tricks on her young mind. But Elisa remembered. Children always remember the things that adults choose to forget. Her dark eyes, wide and knowing beyond her years, fixed on the doorway of room 412, where doctors continued their desperate dance around Edward Klein's failing body. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Fear and certainty warred within her chest, each battling for control of her voice. The almond scent grew stronger, wrapping around her, like an accusation, like a warning that no one else could hear. In that moment, suspended between childhood and terrible understanding, Elisa Lopez knew that something was profoundly, dangerously wrong. And she knew that the adults rushing past her would not listen. They never did. Elisa's small hand reached out and tugged at the worn fabric of her mother's cleaning uniform, fingers twisting into the polyester with the desperate intensity of a child who knows something terrible but lacks the words to make adults understand. Marta Lopez stood frozen in the corridor, her cleaning cart positioned beside her like a shield. Her entire body tense with the kind of fear that comes from living perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. She had been wiping down the nurse's station counter when she noticed her daughter's pale face, when she saw those wide eyes filled with recognition and dread. The child's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, trembling with urgency that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders to carry. "Mama, something's wrong. It smells like when Dad got sick. That smell. It's here again." The words hung in the sterile air between them like an accusation, like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Marta's hand flew to her daughter's mouth with reflexive speed, pressing gently but firmly against those lips that threatened to speak dangerous truths. Her eyes darted left and right down the corridor, scanning for administrators, for supervisors, for anyone who might have heard. The hospital hummed with its nighttime rhythm around them, machines beeping in distant rooms, footsteps echoing from unseen hallways. But Marta heard only the pounding of her own heart and the warning bells that rang in her mind. She couldn't afford this. She couldn't afford questions or complications or a 7-year-old daughter pointing fingers at smells that doctors hadn't noticed. The rent was due in 5 days. The electricity bill sat unpaid on their kitchen table. Her husband's funeral expenses still arrived in monthly installments that carved chunks from her meager paycheck. This job at St. Augustine Memorial was all that stood between her family and the street, between survival and catastrophe. Marta had learned long ago that poor women don't get to speak up. Don't get to make waves, don't get to insist that something is wrong when everyone with authority and education says everything is fine. She knelt down to her daughter's level, her knees protesting against the hard floor, and looked into those eyes that saw too much, understood too much. "Elisa, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of impossible choices. "Please, Mia Moore, we can't. Not here, not now. Mama needs this job." But Elisa's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened with a resolve that seemed ancient in such a young face. Her small jaw set with determination, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She had watched her father die in a room that smelled of bitter almonds while adults ignored her, patted her head, told her she was imagining things. She had been powerless then, voiceless then. The memory of his final gasping breaths played behind her eyes like a film she couldn't stop watching. Her father had clutched her hand and told her to be brave, to be strong, to speak truth even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The child's quiet plea collided with adult fear and silence like waves crashing against an immovable wall. Mother and daughter stood locked in that moment, two different kinds of terror reflected in their faces. Outside the glass doors of the ICU suite, news of Edward Klein's mysterious collapse had begun to spread through the hospital like wildfire through dry grass. Investors were already making frantic phone calls. The hospital board had activated their crisis management protocols. Security guards took up positions at every entrance to the executive floor, transforming the medical wing into a fortress of secrecy and protection. No unauthorized personnel allowed, no questions entertained, no 7-year-old girls with their dangerous observations welcome. Marta pulled Elisa close, wrapping her arms around the small body that felt so fragile yet somehow so immovably strong. She pressed her lips to her daughter's hair and closed her eyes against tears that threatened to fall. In that embrace, both of them understood the terrible mathematics of poverty and power. They understood that sometimes love means silence, even when silence might mean death. The observation window of the ICU suite stretched like a theater screen before Elisa's eyes, cold glass. Separating her from a drama she understood better than any of the adults rushing across that sterile stage. She had positioned herself in the shadows of the waiting area, small enough to be overlooked, quiet enough to be forgotten. But her gaze never wavered from the controlled chaos unfolding in Edward Klein's room. Doctors moved in and out with the precise choreography of emergency medicine. Their faces masks of professional concern that couldn't quite hide the confusion brewing beneath. Dr. Jonathan Hale stood at the center of it all. A tall figure with shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of every unsolved mystery his decades of medicine had accumulated. His silver hair caught the harsh fluorescent light as he bent over Klein's chart for what must have been the 20th time that night. His fingers traced the same lines of data again and again, searching for patterns that refused to reveal themselves. He straightened finally, one hand rubbing at the deep lines etched across his forehead, and spoke to the attending physician beside him with a voice that carried through the glass. No infection, no heart failure, no toxins on record. The words emerged weary but meticulous, each syllable weighted with frustration. Hale's eyes swept across the monitors displaying Klein's vital signs, across lab results that showed nothing abnormal. Everything pointed to a healthy 78-year-old man who should not be dying, yet death circled closer with each passing hour. The physician shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man who had run out of conventional answers. Elisa watched all of this unfold with the intensity of a witness who knows the truth but cannot speak it. Her small hand pressed against the observation glass, palm flat, fingers splayed as if she could somehow reach through the barrier and shake these learned adults into seeing what she saw. Her breath fogged the window in small circles that expanded and faded with each exhalation. The bitter almond scent still clung to her memory, sharp and undeniable, mixing with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. She opened her mouth, and the words came out in a whisper that only the glass could hear. "He's sick like Daddy." The sentence hung in the air like a prayer or a prophecy, spoken by a child who had learned that adults don't listen to truths delivered in young voices. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting the harsh lights of the ICU, reflecting the memory of another hospital room, where another man had gasped for breath while doctors stood baffled. The same pattern, the same mysterious collapse, the same inexplicable failure of organs that should have been strong. But no one had listened then, and no one would listen now. Security appeared then, materializing with the inevitability of institutional authority. A guard in a crisp uniform approached Elisa with the kind of firm gentleness reserved for removing problems that look like innocent children. His hand gestured toward the elevator, his voice professional. As he explained that only authorized family members could remain on this floor, that visiting hours were long over. Elisa allowed herself to be guided away, her small feet shuffling across the linoleum. Her head turning back one last time to look through that glass window at the man who was dying the same way her father had died. But in that final glance, something changed. Dr. Jonathan Hale looked up from his charts, his weary gaze catching on the small figure being escorted away. For just a moment, their eyes met through the glass. He saw her fear-filled eyes, saw the knowledge burning there, saw something that made him pause mid-breath. His hand stilled on the chart. His expression shifted from confusion to doubt, to the first whisper of suspicion that maybe everyone had been looking in the wrong direction. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens somewhere in the Brooklyn night. Elisa sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the worn carpet rough beneath her knees. While moonlight filtered through thin curtains and painted silver stripes across the cramped space she shared with her mother. She had waited until Marta fell into exhausted sleep, still wearing her work uniform, curled on the couch with one arm dangling toward the floor. The child moved with practiced silence, her small fingers reaching into her mother's worn canvas bag that sat by the door. Searching through cleaning supplies and crumpled receipts until she found what she knew must be there. The manila folder emerged from the bag's depths like evidence from a crime scene, its edges softened by handling, its contents heavy with loss. Elisa carried it to her room and spread the papers across her floor with reverent care. Her father's hospital records stared back at her in sterile medical terminology that she couldn't fully understand but recognized with bone-deep certainty. Her small index finger traced the words printed in cold black ink, following the clinical narrative of her father's final days. Then she found it, the diagnosis line that made her breath catch. Respiratory failure, unknown cause, the same words. The exact same words she had heard the nurses whisper about Edward Klein. The same confusion, the same mysterious collapse of lungs that should have been strong. Her father had been only 42 years old, a construction worker with muscles hardened by labor. A man who had never smoked, who had climbed scaffolding without ever growing winded. Yet he had died gasping for air while doctors stood around his bed with the same bewildered expressions she had seen on Dr. Jonathan Hale's face tonight. Elisa's jaw set with determination that seemed too fierce for a 7-year-old child. She knew what adults would say if she tried to tell them. They would pat her head and speak in those soft voices reserved for children who don't understand how the world works. They would tell her she was confused, that she was seeing patterns where none existed, that grief was making her imagine connections that weren't real. But Elisa knew the truth that lived in her bones and in her memory. She had smelled that bitter almond scent in her father's room. She had smelled it again tonight near Edward Klein. And no amount of adult dismissal could erase what her senses had witnessed. She gathered the papers with hands that shook slightly from fear and resolve intertwined. Moving to her small desk, she found school pencils and lined paper. With painstaking care, she began to copy her father's records, her childlike handwriting. Transforming medical jargon into uneven letters that sprawled across the page. It took her nearly an hour, her eyes growing heavy, her hand cramping, but she persisted until she had captured the essential details. The date of admission, the progression of symptoms, the mysterious decline, the final diagnosis of unknown cause. When her mother's shift began again the next evening, Elisa tucked the copied papers into her jacket and followed Marta to St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. She waited until her mother's cleaning cart disappeared around a corner, then moved through the corridors with the confidence of a child on a mission. She found Dr. Hale's office on the 3rd floor, his name printed on a placard beside the door. The office was empty, the lights off, but the door stood unlocked. Elisa slipped inside and placed the file on his desk with careful precision, centering it where he couldn't possibly miss it. Then she picked up a pen that lay beside his computer and wrote across the top of the papers in her unmistakable scrawl, each letter large and urgent. "He smells like my dad." Dr. Jonathan Hale arrived at his office at 6:30 in the morning. Carrying a paper cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm and a briefcase heavy with unreviewed files. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as he pushed through the door, illuminating the familiar chaos of medical journals and patient charts. But something was different. Something sat centered on his desk with deliberate precision, demanding attention. A folder of wrinkled papers covered with a child's handwriting, uneven letters sprawling across the top in pencil pressed hard enough to leave indentations. "He smells like my dad." Hale set down his coffee and stared at the message, his tired mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then he picked up the papers and began to read. The records belonged to Manuel Lopez, deceased 7 months prior at 42 years old. Construction worker. No significant medical history. Admitted with sudden respiratory distress. Rapid deterioration despite aggressive intervention. Final diagnosis: respiratory failure, unknown cause. The words swam before Hale's eyes as understanding began to crystallize like ice forming across glass. He had dismissed the child last night, had watched security escort her away without a second thought. But she had seen something. She had known something. His hands moved almost without conscious direction, pulling up Edward Klein's file on his computer, placing it side by side with Manuel Lopez's copied records. The metabolic patterns stared back at him with undeniable similarity. Both patients showed identical markers: dangerously low oxygen saturation, elevated lactic acid, indicating cellular oxygen starvation, unexplained fatigue preceding respiratory collapse. The parallel was impossible to ignore, yet every physician who had treated these cases had missed it. Because they were looking at each patient in isolation, not as pieces of a larger pattern. Hale's conscience erupted into warfare with protocol and institutional hierarchy. He could hear the hospital administrator's voice. Already, warning about liability, about making accusations without proof, about ordering tests that weren't clinically indicated. Edward Klein was a billionaire whose medical bills would be scrutinized by lawyers. An unscheduled toxicology screen would raise questions, would require justification. But sitting there in his quiet office with a child's desperate message in his hands, Hale realized he had reached the limit of what his conscience could tolerate. He picked up the phone and dialed the hospital laboratory with fingers that trembled slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. His voice when he spoke carried the authority of 3 decades in medicine. "This is Dr. Hale. I need a comprehensive toxicology panel on Edward Klein. Patient ID 77492. I want screening for everything and specifically test for cyanide compounds. Yes, I know it's not standard protocol. Mark it as physician ordered, stat priority. The results arrived 3 hours later. Hale tore open the envelope with hands that had steadied into surgical calm. The numbers told a story that made his blood run cold. Trace amounts of cyanide compounds present in the blood. Not enough for acute poisoning, but repeated small doses over time, each carefully calibrated to damage without immediately killing. A slow poisoning disguised as mysterious illness, requiring medical knowledge and cold calculation. Hale didn't waste time. He called for the emergency response team and ordered immediate administration of hydroxycobalamin, the antidote for cyanide poisoning. Within 30 minutes, Edward Klein's oxygen saturation began to climb. His respiratory rate steadied. Color returned to his gray face like dawn breaking after endless night. For the first time since his collapse, genuine hope flickered in the monitors surrounding his bed. The conference room on the 4th floor of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital had been transformed into a makeshift command center, its walls now covered with timeline charts and patient records arranged in careful chronology. Police Detective Rachel Dunn sat across from Dr. Jonathan Hale, her sharp eyes moving between the evidence spread before them and the physician's exhausted face. She was a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and an expression that suggested she had seen too much of humanity's darkness to be surprised by anything. Yet even she had raised an eyebrow when Hale explained that a 7-year-old child had broken the case open. The deliberate poisoning of Edward Klein meant they were looking at attempted murder with medical knowledge. Dunn had begun investigating possible internal tampering, pulling employee records and security footage, building a timeline of everyone who had access to Klein's room. The hospital administration had protested, citing privacy concerns and reputation damage. But the presence of cyanide compounds in a patient's bloodstream had a way of cutting through bureaucratic resistance. Elisa Lopez sat in the corner of the conference room, small and silent on a chair that made her feet dangle above the floor. Her mother Marta stood behind her with protective hands resting on the child's shoulders, anxiety radiating from every line of her body. Dunn leaned forward now, her voice gentle but direct as she addressed the 7-year-old who held the key to everything. Elisa, I need you to think very carefully. You said you smelled something strange near Mr. Klein's room, the same smell from when your father was sick. Did you see anyone unusual? Anyone who appeared in both places? The child's brow furrowed with concentration, her dark eyes distant as she reached back into memories that still carried the sharp edge of loss. She closed her eyes and let herself remember those terrible days when her father lay dying. The corridors had all looked the same, endless hallways of white walls and antiseptic floors. But there had been someone. A woman who had appeared during the shift changes, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged, someone who wouldn't be questioned. Elisa's eyes snapped open with sudden clarity. A woman with red glasses. She was near my dad's room. I saw her talking to the nurses. And last night, I saw her again near Mr. Klein's door when I was waiting for Mama. Dunn exchanged a glance with Hale, something electric passing between them. The detective pulled up security footage on her laptop, scrubbing through hours of hallway cameras with practiced efficiency. The images flickered past in accelerated motion until suddenly Dunn froze the frame. There, captured in grainy digital clarity, was a woman in surgical scrubs entering the ICU suite during a shift change. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and perched on her nose were distinctive red-framed glasses that caught the overhead lights. Dr. Isabel Frost, Hale said quietly, recognition dawning with the weight of betrayal. She's an anesthesiologist, one of our best. Dunn's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up personnel files and cross-referencing them with the dates of Manuel Lopez's hospitalization. Isabel Frost had been on duty during Lopez's admission, during his deterioration, and the night Edward Klein collapsed. The pattern was undeniable, yet even as the evidence mounted, Hale found himself struggling with disbelief. Isabel Frost was a respected colleague, a physician with an impeccable record who had dedicated her life to healing. Why would a doctor sworn to save lives systematically poison her own patients? What possible motive could drive such calculated betrayal? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered but urgent, as suspicion sharpened into certainty and the hunt began. Detective Rachel Dunn's investigation peeled back the layers of Dr. Isabel Frost's life like a surgeon exposing diseased tissue beneath healthy skin. The personnel file had revealed nothing suspicious at first: impeccable credentials, stellar performance reviews, 15 years of service at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital without a single complaint. But Dunn had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were often those who hid their darkness behind walls of professional perfection. She dug deeper, following digital trails through social media archives and newspaper obituaries, searching for the crack in the facade. She found it in a death certificate dated 18 months prior. Thomas Frost, age 34, cause of death listed as complications from misdiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia. Isabel's younger brother. The name triggered another search, leading to a malpractice lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. Thomas Frost had visited an emergency clinic complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. An artificial intelligence diagnostic system developed by Klein Medical Technologies had analyzed his symptoms and vital signs, then concluded with 92% certainty that he was experiencing a panic attack rather than a cardiac event. The human physicians had trusted the algorithm. They had sent Thomas home with anti-anxiety medication. He had died in his apartment 6 hours later from a massive heart attack that the AI had completely failed to detect. The lawsuit had been buried under layers of non-disclosure agreements and financial settlements. Klein Medical Technologies had paid $3 million and issued a carefully worded statement about improving their algorithms. Edward Klein himself had never acknowledged personal responsibility, had never admitted that his pursuit of automated medicine had prioritized profit over the messy complexity of human suffering. For him, Thomas Frost had been a statistic, an acceptable margin of error in the grand project of replacing human doctors with code. But for Isabel Frost, Thomas had been everything. Her baby brother, the brilliant artist who painted murals that transformed gray city walls into gardens of impossible color. The gentle soul who called her every Sunday just to hear her voice. The only family she had left after their parents died in a car accident when they were teenagers. Dunn found photos on an archived social media account: Isabel and Thomas laughing at a birthday celebration, their faces pressed together in sibling affection. The photos stopped abruptly 18 months ago, replaced by a single black square and a caption that read simply, "Gone but never forgotten." The detective sat in her car outside Frost's apartment building, watching the windows of the third-floor unit where a light still burned despite the late hour. She imagined Isabel sitting in that apartment night after night, her grief fermenting into something toxic and deliberate. The vendetta had transformed into an elaborate plan of revenge disguised as medical care. Frost had studied cyanide compounds, had learned the precise dosing that would mimic respiratory failure without triggering immediate alarms. She had chosen her victims with cold calculation. Edward Klein, the architect of the system that killed her brother, and Manuel Lopez, a test subject to perfect her method. "I'm fixing the system he built," Frost had written in a journal entry that Dunn discovered on her seized laptop. The words glowing with the certainty of someone who believed her own justifications. Inside her mind, Frost had constructed a moral framework where killing wasn't murder but justice, where poison wasn't crime but correction. She was preparing her final act even as the net closed around her, while the hospital administration refused to believe their own staff could be involved. The ICU suite at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital had been transformed into a stage set for deception, every detail carefully orchestrated by Dr. Jonathan Hale and Detective Rachel Dunn. Edward Klein lay in his bed with monitors displaying vital signs that had been subtly manipulated to suggest he remained in critical condition. His oxygen levels artificially lowered on the screens while the real numbers stayed safely elevated. The medical staff had been briefed in hushed conferences, sworn to secrecy. Instructed to maintain the fiction that their billionaire patient teetered on the edge of death. It was a dangerous gambit, using a recovering man as bait, but Klein himself had insisted once he learned the truth about his poisoning. The hospital corridors settled into their midnight quiet, that peculiar hush when the day shift had departed. And the skeleton crew of night workers moved through dimly lit hallways like ghosts. Dunn had positioned plainclothes officers at strategic points throughout the floor, dressed as orderlies and maintenance workers. Their radios hidden beneath uniforms, their eyes constantly scanning for the distinctive red glasses that had become the symbol of betrayal. Hale remained in his office with the lights on, visible through the glass door, creating the impression of a physician working late on desperate cases. In the corridor outside the ICU, Marta Lopez pushed her cleaning cart with methodical precision. But tonight she was part of the operation, her presence requested by Dunn because Frost would recognize her and dismiss her as harmless. Hidden behind a supply closet door, 7-year-old Elisa watched through a crack. The girl's fingers gripped the door frame with white-knuckled intensity, her breath shallow with fear and anticipation. The clock on the wall marked the passage of time with mechanical indifference. 11:45, 11:50. Midnight approached like a held breath. Then, at precisely 12:03 in the morning, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor. Dr. Isabel Frost walked with the confident stride of someone who belonged, her surgical scrubs crisp and professional, her red-framed glasses catching the fluorescent light. In her hand she carried a small medical bag, the kind anesthesiologists routinely used to transport medications. Her face appeared calm, almost serene, as if she were simply making rounds. Hale and Dunn watched through security monitors as Frost approached Klein's room, her hand reaching for the door handle. The detective's fingers hovered over the radio transmitter. But then Frost paused. Her head turned slightly, as if some instinct warned her that the air felt wrong, that the silence carried a quality of watchfulness. Her hand retreated from the door. Her body tensed with the alertness of prey-sensing hunters. Elisa saw the change in Frost's posture, saw the moment when suspicion bloomed across the woman's features. Without thinking, the child pushed open the supply closet door and stepped into the corridor. Her small voice carrying through the quiet with unexpected strength. "I know what you did. I know you hurt my daddy and Mr. Klein." The words hung in the sterile air like an accusation from the grave. Frost's head snapped toward the child, her eyes widening behind the red glasses. For a frozen moment, doctor and child stared at each other across the corridor. Then Frost ran. She turned and fled toward the emergency stairwell, her medical bag dropping and spilling syringes across the floor. Plainclothes officers emerged from hiding places with drawn weapons. But Frost made it only 3 steps before her legs buckled and she collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit on the cold floor with her hands pressed against her face. The chase ended before it began, her body surrendering to 18 months of grief and guilt that no amount of revenge could lift. 6 weeks after Dr. Isabel Frost's arrest, Edward Klein sat in a private room at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. That no longer felt like a prison but rather a place of uncomfortable reckoning. His recovery had been remarkable, his lungs clearing as the cyanide compounds were flushed from his system, his strength returning with each passing day. But the physical healing had revealed a different kind of damage, one that no antidote could cure. The billionaire who had built an empire on the promise of technological perfection now spent his days reading letters from families whose loved ones had been misdiagnosed by his artificial intelligence systems, each message a testament to the human cost of his pursuit of efficiency over empathy. Detective Dunn had shared the full investigation findings with him, including the painful details of Thomas Frost's death and Isabel's descent into vengeful madness. Klein had listened with a face that seemed to age years in hours. His hands trembling as he held the file that outlined how his company's algorithm had failed to detect a fatal heart condition because it had been trained primarily on data from wealthy patients. Thomas Frost, a struggling artist with gaps in his healthcare records, had fallen through the cracks of a system designed to serve people exactly like Edward Klein himself. The realization settled over him like a shroud woven from guilt and belated understanding. He had built a god that forgot mercy, had created a system that treated human lives as data points to be optimized rather than sacred mysteries to be honored. His technology had promised to democratize healthcare, but in practice, it had simply encoded existing inequalities into lines of code that couldn't see what they hadn't been taught to value. On this particular afternoon, Dr. Jonathan Hale and Marta Lopez stood near the window of Klein's room, watching as the billionaire prepared to meet the child who had saved his life. Marta's hands twisted nervously in front of her, still unable to fully believe that she stood in this room as a guest rather than as invisible labor. Hale had insisted on her presence, had told Klein that understanding the full story meant understanding what Marta and her daughter had risked and lost. The door opened and Elisa entered, her small hand held by a hospital social worker. The 7-year-old wore a clean dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon. But her eyes still carried that ancient quality of someone who had witnessed more pain than childhood should hold. She walked toward Edward Klein with careful steps, neither fearful nor eager, simply present in the way children are. When they haven't yet learned to perform emotions they don't feel. Klein's eyes filled with tears as he looked at her, this small person who had seen through his mortality to the poisoning beneath. Who had refused to be silent when adults demanded her compliance. His throat worked for a moment before he could speak, his voice emerging rough with emotion. You saw what I refused to see. I built systems that didn't listen to people like you and your father. I thought technology could replace wisdom, that algorithms could replace compassion. I was wrong, and my arrogance cost your father his life. Elisa studied his face with that unsettling directness that children possess before the world teaches them to look away from difficult truths. She didn't offer easy forgiveness or platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging his words without absolving him of responsibility. My daddy used to say that being smart and being good aren't the same thing. Maybe you can learn to be both. The simple statement hit Klein with more force than any boardroom criticism ever had. Marta wiped at her eyes, her hand finding Hale's sleeve in a gesture of shared grief and hope. The autumn sun cast golden light across the steps of the newly established Lopez Initiative headquarters. A modest building in Brooklyn that had once been a community center before Edward Klein purchased and renovated it with funds that felt less like charity and more like restitution. 6 months had passed since the night Dr. Isabel Frost collapsed in the hospital corridor. 6 months of trials and testimonies and slow transformations that couldn't be measured in courtroom victories alone. The building's facade bore a bronze plaque with Manuel Lopez's name and dates. Along with an inscription that read, "He taught us to listen when others looked away." Inside the main hall, rows of chairs had been filled with hospital administrators, medical professionals, child advocacy groups, and families who had lost loved ones to medical errors that might have been prevented if someone had simply listened. Marta Lopez sat in the front row wearing a navy blue dress, her hands folded in her lap but no longer twisted with anxious fear. Beside her sat Dr. Jonathan Hale, his weathered face softened by something that looked almost like peace, and Detective Rachel Dunn, whose sharp eyes had grown gentler in the months since the case closed. At the podium stood Edward Klein, thinner than he had been before his poisoning, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. But his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. He spoke about the Lopez Initiative's mission to create formal channels for children and families to report medical concerns, without fear of being ignored, about the advisory board. That would include pediatric patients alongside physicians, about the technology systems being redesigned to flag discrepancies between algorithmic diagnoses and patient observations. His words carried the weight of someone who had looked into the abyss of his own creation and chosen to rebuild rather than justify. Then it was Elisa's turn to speak. The 8-year-old walked to the podium with a confidence that hadn't existed 6 months ago. Her small frame barely visible behind the microphone that had to be lowered to accommodate her height. The audience fell into attentive silence as she looked out at them with those dark eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. Her voice when she spoke was clear and strong, each word carefully chosen. When something feels wrong, even kids can be right. My daddy couldn't tell the doctors what was happening to him because they weren't listening. Mr. Klein almost died because nobody listened to me. But Dr. Hale listened, and Detective Dunn listened, and that's why we're all here today. She paused, her eyes finding her mother in the front row. Finding the woman who had been forced to choose between speaking up and keeping her job, between protecting her daughter and protecting their survival. Marta's face was wet with tears, her hand pressed against her mouth as if to hold back the grief and pride that threatened to overwhelm her. This place is for all the kids who know something's wrong but don't know how to make grown-ups listen. It's for all the parents who are scared to speak up. And it's to remember my daddy and everyone like him who should still be here." The applause that followed was thunderous but respectful, acknowledging pain alongside hope. Elisa stepped back from the podium and walked directly to her mother, who stood and wrapped her daughter in an embrace that spoke of everything they had survived together. Hale and Klein rose as well, standing beside the Lopez family, not as saviors but as witnesses to a transformation that had begun with a child's refusal to be silenced. As the ceremony concluded and people filed out into the golden afternoon, Elisa's voice could be heard one final time, speaking to a reporter who had asked her what she wanted people to remember. "Sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that saves the world. Often, the truth doesn't come from power or knowledge. It comes from the courage to listen when no one else will." If this story moved you, share it with someone who's ever been ignored, or someone who still believes that every voice deserves to be heard. Leave your thoughts below. We read everyone, and your stories matter too. And if you believe that compassion still changes lives, subscribe and stay with us for more true stories that remind us how. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.